the mountain was silent. No warning, no sirens, no time to run. In less than 4 minutes, everything that had taken decades to build homes, roads, schools, entire neighborhoods was gone, buried under millions of tons of ice, rock, and debris, moving faster than a freight train. This is not a hypothetical scenario. This is not a disaster movie plot. This happened. And it happened in a way that scientists, geologists, and emergency experts are still struggling to fully explain. On June 26, 2025, the Annapurna region in Nepal experienced one of the most catastrophic avalanche-triggered disasters in recent Himalayan history, catching entire communities completely off guard and reshaping our understanding of how fast natural disasters can erase human presence from a landscape. Today, we are going to walk through exactly what happened, the science behind it, the warning signs that were missed or ignored, the human stories buried beneath the snow, and what this event is forcing engineers and governments around the world to rethink. This is the story of how an avalanche destroys a city in minutes. If this kind of deep dive content speaks to you, subscribe right now. We publish every week. Hit the like button so this video reaches more people who deserve to know what really happened here, and drop a comment below. Did you hear about this disaster when it happened? Let us know. To understand what happened on June 26, 2025, you first need to understand where it happened and why that place was always a disaster, waiting for the right conditions to trigger it. Nepal sits at the collision point of two of the most powerful tectonic forces on the planet. The Indian tectonic plate has been slowly but relentlessly pushing northward into the Eurasian plate for approximately 50 million years. The result of that collision is the Himalayas, the highest mountain range on Earth, and arguably the most geologically unstable. The Annapurna Massif, specifically, is one of the world's most treacherous mountain environments. Annapurna I, at 8,091 meters above sea level, holds the grim distinction of having the highest fatality-to-summit ratio of any 8,000er in the world. For every 2 climbers who have successfully reached its peak, approximately 1 has died trying. That statistic alone should tell you something about the nature of the terrain. But the danger in the Annapurna region is not limited to the mountain peaks themselves. The valleys below, particularly the Marsangdai River Valley and its surrounding communities, exist in a natural amphitheater of vertical walls, hanging glaciers, and unstable moraines that have been accumulating ice and debris for thousands of years. According to research published by the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, known as ICIMOD, based in Kathmandu, Nepal has seen a dramatic acceleration in glacial lake outburst floods and avalanche activity over the past 3 decades. The organization's 2023 Hindu Kush Himalaya Assessment Report documented that glaciers across the Himalayas are melting at a rate approximately 65% faster than they were in the 1990s, driven almost entirely by rising global temperatures. What does that mean in practical terms? It means that the natural glue holding massive ice formations to rock faces is weakening. Permafrost, the frozen ground that acts as structural foundation for mountain slopes, is thawing at depth. Internal water pressure within glaciers and ice fields is increasing, and the result is a landscape that, from the outside, can look perfectly stable and entirely serene, while internally it is building toward catastrophic release. The communities that live in the shadow of these mountains have always known the risk at some level. The Gurung and Magar peoples who have inhabited the Annapurna region for generations have oral traditions that describe mountains as living entities, capable of anger, capable of movement. Modern science would describe what they observed ancestrally in very different language, but the conclusion is the same. These slopes move. They always have. The question is never if. It is always only when. By the spring of 2025, multiple converging factors have been quietly pushing the Annapurna region toward that, when with an urgency that, in retrospect, was terrifyingly clear. Disasters rarely arrive without warning. What they do, far more often, is arrive with warnings that are either not understood, not communicated, or not acted upon in time. The weeks leading up to June 26, 2025, in the Annapurna region, were a near textbook example of this pattern. Nepal had experienced an unusually intense pre-monsoon season in May and June of 2025. Meteorological records from the Department of Hydrology and Meteorology in Kathmandu show rainfall accumulations in the Annapurna Conservation Area that were approximately 40% above the historical average for that period. In the highlands above 4,000 meters, where temperatures were still cold enough to produce snow and ice precipitation, snowpack was building at rates that exceeded standard monitoring thresholds. At the same time, unusually warm temperatures at mid-elevation between 2,500 and 4,000 meters had been accelerating the melting of the lower snowpack. This created a dangerous combination. Heavy new precipitation loading slopes from above, while the structural integrity of the layers beneath was being compromised by melt. Satellite imagery analyzed by ICIMOD and cross-referenced by researchers at the University of Oslo's Department of Geosciences shows that a large hanging glacier on the northeastern face of the Annapurna Massif had been exhibiting measurable movement acceleration beginning in late April 2025. Crevasses that had appeared stable in winter imagery were widening. A section of the glacier's terminal zone, the lower edge, appeared to have begun separating from the rock face at multiple points. This kind of pre-failure signature is well documented in glaciological literature. A landmark 2019 study in the journal Nature Geoscience, authored by a multinational team including researchers from ETH Zurich and the Indian Institute of Technology, specifically analyzed pre-collapse signatures of Himalayan glaciers and identified progressive crevasse widening, accelerated surface displacement, and increased meltwater pooling as the three most reliable early indicators of impending failure. All three were present in the Annapurna Glacier system in the weeks before June 26. There were also seismic signals. Nepal's National Seismological Center recorded a series of small, shallow seismic events in the Annapurna region during the first 3 weeks of June 2025. None were strong enough to register as traditional earthquakes. Most were below magnitude 2.0. But shallow, high-frequency, micro-seismic events of this type are now understood to be one of the most reliable precursors to large-scale slope failure in glaciated mountain environments. They indicate internal cracking and stress fracturing within rock and ice formations. The challenge, as it almost always is, was connecting these data streams in real time. Nepal's mountain monitoring infrastructure, despite significant investment following the catastrophic 2015 Gorkha earthquake, remains chronically underfunded relative to the scale of the terrain it must cover. Automated warning stations in the Annapurna Conservation Area number fewer than 30 for an area covering approximately 7,629 square kilometers. A 2024 report by the Nepal Risk Reduction Consortium, a partnership between the United Nations, the World Bank, and the Nepalese government, specifically identified the Annapurna and Manaslu corridors as high-priority zones for expanded monitoring investment. That expanded monitoring had not yet been implemented when June 26 arrived. The morning of June 26, 2025, began quietly in the villages of the Marsangdi Valley. Locals were preparing for another day in the early monsoon season. Tea houses along the Annapurna Circuit trekking route were serving breakfast. Farmers were tending to terraced fields. In the larger settlement areas, children were already in school. At approximately 7:42 in the morning, local time, the hanging glacier on the northeastern face of the Annapurna Massif reached its failure threshold. The collapse began, not as a single dramatic break, but as what geologists call a progressive retrogressive failure, meaning one section gave way, which immediately redistributed stress to adjacent sections, triggering their failure in rapid sequence. Within approximately 90 seconds, an estimated 15 to 20 million cubic meters of ice, rock, and compressed snow had begun moving down slope.
Look at that!
To put that volume into perspective, 20 million cubic meters is roughly equivalent to 8,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools filled simultaneously and dropped from an altitude of several thousand meters. The initial avalanche moved at speeds that witnesses in the lower valley would later describe to Nepalese journalists as like a wall that came from nowhere. Field reconstruction by a joint Nepalese-Swiss geological assessment team, whose preliminary findings were published by the Kathmandu Post in September 2025, estimated peak velocities of the main avalanche body between 200 and 280 kilometers per hour, during its descent through the upper funnel zone, a natural geological channel that had been formed by centuries of previous avalanche and glacial activity, and that effectively amplified and directed the flow. At those velocities, the physics become almost incomprehensible at a human scale. An object moving at 250 kilometers per hour has so much kinetic energy that the air pressure wave preceding the actual debris mass can itself cause significant structural damage. This is called the avalanche blast or air blast, and it is one of the most underestimated aspects of large avalanche disasters. Before a single particle of snow or rock physically contacts a structure, the displaced air can shatter windows, collapse walls, overturn vehicles, and knock people from their feet. By the time the main debris mass reached the inhabited valley floor, it had entrained enormous quantities of additional snow, soil, trees, and rock from the slopes it had scoured on its way down. The original 15 to 20 million cubic meters had grown. The geological assessment team estimated the total volume of debris deposited in the valley zone to be in excess of 35 million cubic meters. Communities in the direct path had, at most, 4 minutes between the first seismic detection of the collapse and the arrival of the debris flow at the valley floor. In some areas directly below the primary run-out zone, the window was less than 2 minutes. 4 minutes. 2 minutes. That is not enough time to evacuate a building, let alone a village. The total area of destruction covered approximately 11 square kilometers of valley floor and lower slope terrain. According to reports filed with the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in the weeks following the disaster, at least 7 distinct settlements were either partially or completely obliterated. Infrastructure losses included road networks essential to the Annapurna circuit, one of Nepal's most economically significant trekking routes, and damage to hydroelectric infrastructure that served not only local communities but contributed to the national grid. The human death toll, always difficult to establish with precision in remote mountain disasters, was reported by the Nepalese Ministry of Home Affairs at over 400 confirmed deaths, with several hundred additional individuals listed as missing. Aid organizations, working on the ground in subsequent weeks, suggested the true number of fatalities was likely significantly higher, given the depth of debris burial in the worst affected zones and the logistical challenges of conducting comprehensive search operations in such terrain. Most people, when they picture an avalanche, picture a cascade of white snow rolling gracefully down a mountain slope. What actually happens in a major Himalayan avalanche event is something entirely different, and understanding the physics of it helps explain why survival rates in direct path zones are so devastatingly low. Large avalanches of the type that struck the Annapurna Valley on June 26, 2025, are classified as mixed-type events, meaning they involve multiple simultaneous flow regimes. At the front of the flow, you have what is called a powder cloud, a turbulent suspension of fine ice crystals and air that can extend hundreds of meters above the main debris mass. This cloud alone can reach densities that make breathing impossible and temperatures well below freezing. It moves fastest and farthest, and it gives the illusion to anyone watching from a distance that the real avalanche is still far away, when in fact the suffocation danger has already arrived. Behind the powder cloud is the dense flow layer, the actual mass of compacted snow, ice, and debris. In the Annapurna event, this layer also incorporated enormous quantities of rock and soil from the slopes. It's scoured, making it what geologists technically classify as a debris avalanche or rock-ice avalanche. This distinction matters because pure snow avalanches, while deadly, have relatively predictable run-out behaviors. Rock-ice avalanches, by contrast, can travel much farther on much shallower slopes because the rock and ice mixture reduces internal friction dramatically. A 2017 paper in the journal Landslides, authored by researchers from the British Geological Survey and the University of Sheffield, analyzed run-out behaviors of 42 major rock-ice avalanches across the Himalayas and Andes, and found that they consistently traveled 30 to 50% farther than predictive models based on pure snow avalanche physics would suggest. This has significant implications for hazard zoning. It means that areas considered safe based on traditional avalanche modeling may not be safe at all when the source zone contains significant rock and ice interaction. When this mixture of ice, rock, and entrained debris arrives at a built environment at speeds of 200 kilometers per hour or more, the destruction is not gradual. It is instantaneous and total. Reinforced concrete structures, the type that Nepal's updated building codes implemented following the 2015 earthquake, now perform reasonably well against earthquake forces. They perform catastrophically against the combined impact and fluid pressure of a debris avalanche. Studies following the 2017 Langtang avalanche in Nepal, which killed more than 200 people and virtually erased the Langtang village from the map, found that even structurally sound reinforced concrete buildings had been completely demolished. The researchers from Kyoto University's Disaster Prevention Research Institute concluded that no conventional building construction technique provides meaningful protection against direct impact from a major debris avalanche. The ground itself changes after an event like this. Beneath 10 to 15 meters of compacted debris, the average deposit depth recorded in the worst affected zones of the June 26th event. The pressure consolidates the material into something closer to soft rock than loose snow or soil. This is why recovery of buried individuals more than a few hours after the event almost always transitions from rescue to recovery. Survival beneath compacted debris at those depths, without an air pocket, is measured not in hours but in minutes.
Good morning.
And this is the reality that makes these events so uniquely devastating compared to other natural disasters. There is almost no intermediate outcome. You are either outside the path, or you are not. Behind every number in a disaster report is a person. Behind every confirmed fatality is a family, a history, a life that was interrupted with no warning on an ordinary morning. In the weeks following June 26, 2025, Nepalese journalists and international correspondents who managed to reach the affected areas, many access routes had been completely severed by the debris, began to document the human texture of what had happened. The Kathmandu Post, one of Nepal's leading English-language newspapers, published a series of detailed survivor testimonies in July 2025. One account, from a man identified as Hari Gurung, a tea house owner in one of the partially affected settlements who had been outside in his fields when the event occurred, described the sound as arriving before anything else. A deep, resonant roar that he initially thought was thunder, followed immediately by the ground shaking in a way that was different from an earthquake, more sustained, more directional. He ran toward higher ground, instinctively, he said, and looked back to see the powder cloud arriving over the ridge above his village. He kept running. He did not stop until he had climbed 200 meters above the valley floor. When he finally stopped and turned, his village was gone. The entire familiar landscape had been replaced by a flat, gray-brown surface of consolidated debris. International trekkers who had been on sections of the Annapurna circuit in adjacent but unaffected areas provided accounts to media outlets including the BBC, Reuters, and Al Jazeera. Several described feeling the blast wave at distances of several kilometers from the main impact zone, a concussion of air that knocked some of them from their feet, and was accompanied by a sound unlike anything they had previously experienced. The rescue effort that followed was one of the largest mobilized in Nepal's history outside of a major earthquake response. The Nepalese army, together with the Armed Police Force Nepal and civilian mountain rescue teams, worked with helicopters from both military and civilian operators, conditions permitting to reach the most isolated affected areas. International assistance arrived from India, China, and several European nations with specialized urban search and rescue capabilities.
Get on board,
But the terrain itself worked against the rescuers. The debris field was unstable for days after the initial event. Secondary slides, as additional ice and snow on the destabilized upper slopes continued to shift, repeatedly halted ground operations. Helicopters faced the dual challenge of altitude. Most landing zones were above 2,000 meters, and the atmospheric particulate generated by the debris field itself, which reduced visibility.
Yes, ma'am. Here are the blankets and water.
Medical teams reaching survivors in the outer zones of the affected area reported injuries consistent with blast trauma, ruptured eardrums, burst blood vessels, lung contusions caused by the pressure wave in individuals who had never been physically struck by any debris. The powder cloud alone had left its mark on human bodies. The long-term displacement effect of the disaster has continued to unfold. UNHCR reports submitted in late 2025 documented approximately 3,800 individuals formally registered as internally displaced from the affected region. For communities whose entire economic existence was built around the Annapurna Circuit trekking industry, which generates tens of millions of dollars annually for Nepal's economy, the destruction of infrastructure and the alteration of the landscape represented not just immediate trauma, but an existential threat to livelihoods that had taken generations to develop. The psychological dimension of disasters of this kind is also only beginning to be understood. Research, following the 2015 Gorkha earthquake, published in the Lancet Psychiatry Journal in 2018, found rates of post-traumatic stress disorder among affected Nepalese populations significantly higher than global post-disaster averages, compounded by the intersection of grief, economic precarity, and the ongoing physical danger of living in a seismically active mountain environment. Experts working with affected communities after the June 26 disaster have noted similar patterns, with the additional psychological burden that, unlike an earthquake, which is essentially invisible in its cause, survivors of an avalanche event live in daily visual proximity to the mountain slopes that devastated their communities.